There's a phrase you'll hear repeated in foreign policy circles, in international relations textbooks, in diplomatic conferences. American exceptionalism. The idea that the United States leads through values, through the rule of law, through example rather than force. It's been the foundation of the post-World War II order for nearly 80 years. A symbol of stability, of predictability, of what global leadership should look like. But symbols have a dangerous quality. They let us believe things are stable when the ground beneath them is already cracking. This week, we need to talk about what's happening in Venezuela, in Iran, and across the Western Hemisphere. Not the sanitized version you'll hear from press conferences, not the talking points designed to justify military action, the reality. Because what's unfolding right now is not just regime change. It's the quiet transformation of American foreign policy from leadership to extraction. And the implications are already showing up in places Washington refuses to acknowledge. Let me start with something concrete. Something that happened 5 days ago that should have shocked the world but somehow didn't. On January 3rd, 2026, the United States military conducted an invasion of Venezuela. Over 150 military aircraft, naval vessels, special operations forces. They landed at a military fort in Caracas at 2 in the morning, extracted the country's president, and flew him to New York to face charges. This wasn't a covert operation. This wasn't a small-scale raid. This was a full military incursion into a sovereign nation with 28 million people. And according to the current administration, the United States is now going to run Venezuela. Let me repeat that. Run Venezuela. Not support a democratic transition. Not assist opposition forces. Run the country. Control the oil infrastructure. Manage the economy. Determine who leads the government. This is what the administration is openly stating. Now, the justification you'll hear is about narco-trafficking and democracy. The operation was framed as an effort to combat drug trafficking and so-called narco-terrorism. Officials will tell you this was about protecting Americans from cocaine and fentanyl, about removing a dictator who stole elections and oppressed his people. It's a compelling story. It's emotionally satisfying. It's also transparently incomplete. Because listen to what was actually said in the press conference afterward. The focus wasn't on democracy. It wasn't primarily about drugs. It was about oil. Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves in the world, and multiple statements made it clear that controlling that oil infrastructure, rebuilding it with American companies, and profiting from it was a core objective. Following the raid, statements made clear that oil was a core motivation for the operations against Venezuela, with officials claiming that Venezuela had stolen oil from companies. The stated plan is to have oil companies come in, spend money rebuilding the infrastructure, and then get reimbursed through revenue. American companies invest. Venezuela's oil flows. The United States takes a cut. This isn't liberation. This is extraction with a military escort. And here's what should terrify you. This operation cost an estimated $600 million. 15,000 troops deployed. 150 aircraft. Naval vessels. Special operations forces. All to remove one person and install the same regime structure with different people at the top. The political reality inside Venezuela remains largely unchanged, as removal did not dismantle the brutal regime. It merely shifted power to the vice president, who continues to oversee the same repressive apparatus. The vice president, handpicked by the ousted leader, is now in charge. The defense minister, the security apparatus, the military command structure, all still in place. This wasn't regime change. This was leadership decapitation while leaving the system intact. But Venezuela isn't happening in isolation. Because once you establish that the United States can simply invade a country, extract its leader, and take control of resources, you've opened a door that doesn't close easily. And the administration knows it. Listen to what's been said about other countries in the region. Colombia. The president was accused of running cocaine mills and factories. When asked whether military intervention similar to Venezuela was on the cards, the response was, "It sounds good to me." Not a diplomatic statement. Not a measured response. An open suggestion that Colombia could be next. Cuba. The analysis is straightforward. Cuba relies on Venezuela for money and oil, and with that relationship severed, the assessment is that Cuba is going to fail with no alternatives. No plans for humanitarian assistance. No discussion of transition support. just an acknowledgement that economic collapse is coming and shrugging about the consequences. Greenland. Repeated threats to annex an autonomous territory of Denmark, a NATO ally. Not through negotiation, through pressure and implied force. This isn't about national security. This is about resources. Greenland has critical minerals. And apparently, if you have something valuable, sovereignty becomes negotiable. This is a pattern, and the pattern is clear. Resource-rich regions in the Western Hemisphere are being treated as assets to be acquired rather than sovereign nations to be respected. The justification keeps shifting. Sometimes it's drugs. Sometimes it's democracy. Sometimes it's national security. But the outcome is always the same. American control, American extraction, American profit. And here's what's most dangerous. The Trump administration's proclaimed corollary to the Monroe Doctrine apparently makes it believe it can do what it wants in the Western Hemisphere. This isn't 21st century diplomacy. This is 19th century imperialism with modern military technology. Now, officials will tell you this was a cost-free operation. Clean, efficient, no American casualties. Mission accomplished. It's the narrative designed to make this seem like smart foreign policy. Let's talk about what that narrative ignores. First, the financial cost. Current extended deployments for the campaign involve up to 15,000 troops and cost more than $600 million. That's not counting long-term occupation costs, reconstruction expenses, or the ongoing military presence that will be required. These numbers will grow. They always do. Second, the legal cost. This operation was conducted without congressional authorization. The Constitution is clear. Only Congress can authorize war, and there was no congressional approval for this attack. The justification used was Article 2 constitutional powers and designating drug cartels as terrorist organizations, allowing military force without a declaration of war. This is an enormous expansion of executive power, and it sets a precedent that future administrations will exploit. Third, the international cost. The attacks violate Article 2 of the UN Charter, which protects the sovereignty of nations. The United States just demonstrated that international law is optional when you have military superiority. Every other country watching this understands the message. Sovereignty is conditional. Treaties are negotiable. Might makes right. But here's the cost that matters most. Trust. When you invade a neighboring country, extract its leader, and declare you're going to run their economy, what signal does that send? It tells every country in the hemisphere, you are not safe. It tells allies, the United States will violate international norms when convenient. It tells adversaries, American word means nothing. And once that signal is sent, once trust is destroyed, you cannot simply rebuild it with a press release or a change in policy. Trust loss is asymmetric. It disappears in a military operation. It returns over decades, if it returns at all. Let's be very direct about what this is actually about. Oil. Venezuela nationalized its oil industry decades ago. American companies lost access to reserves and infrastructure they had previously controlled, and there has been a decades-long effort to regain that access. Through sanctions, through diplomatic pressure, through support for opposition movements, and now, through military force. The administration's recent military actions risked the lives of service members at a steep cost to taxpayers, all in an effort to benefit big oil donors. During the campaign, there was a push for oil and gas executives to raise significant funds, with promises to deliver on their policy priorities if re-elected. The industry contributed at least $96 million directly to the campaign and super PACs. This is the connection nobody wants to talk about. Campaign contributions from oil companies, promises to prioritize their interests, and then, conveniently, a military operation that gives those companies access to the world's largest oil reserves. The official line is that oil prices will come down, that gasoline will be cheaper, that this benefits American consumers. And yes, if Venezuelan oil floods the market, prices could drop temporarily. But let's be clear about who actually benefits. American consumers might save a few cents per gallon. Oil companies will make billions. The costs, military spending, international blowback, long-term occupation will be paid by taxpayers. The profits will go to shareholders. This is classic wealth extraction. Socialize the costs. Privatize the profits. Wrap it in a flag and call it national interest. Now, While Venezuela dominates headlines, something equally significant is happening in Iran, and the parallels are striking. Beginning on December 28, mass demonstrations erupted across multiple cities in Iran amid widespread dissatisfaction and a deepening economic crisis. What started with shopkeepers protesting currency collapse has evolved into the largest outbreak of unrest since the protests following the death of Mahsa Amini. The Iranian rial has collapsed. The currency fell to approximately 145,000 tomans per dollar, with inflation reported at 42.2% in December. Food prices have surged. Basic necessities are out of reach for ordinary Iranians, and people are in the streets demanding change. This is a regime under extraordinary pressure. Iran's nuclear program has been severely damaged due to Israeli and U.S. military strikes, and the capabilities of its allies in the region have been eroded, with some former partners no longer in power. The economic situation is catastrophic. The political situation is unstable, and there are now intelligence reports suggesting that Khamenei has an escape plan for him and about 20 close associates and family members ready to flee to Moscow. Think about that. The supreme leader of Iran, who has ruled for decades, apparently has a plan to flee to Russia if the regime collapses. That's not a sign of strength. That's desperation. And here's where it connects to Venezuela. Because the stated U.S. position is explicit. If they start shooting at protesters, these people who are totally unarmed, there will be a very hard response. This is a public pledge to intervene militarily if the Iranian regime cracks down. So we have a pattern. Venezuela, where military force was used to remove a leader and take control of oil. Iran, where military force is threatened to support protesters and potentially enable regime change. And conveniently, Iran also has significant oil reserves and strategic resources. Let me talk about something that doesn't show up in national security briefings, but matters more than almost anything else. Precedent. For the past 75 years, the international order has been based on certain principles. Sovereign nations don't invade each other without cause. Leadership changes happen internally. Resources belong to the countries where they're located. Disputes get resolved through diplomacy, sanctions, international pressure, not military force. These weren't perfect principles. They were violated. But they were the framework. They created predictability. They made long-term planning possible. They reduced the likelihood of major conflicts. And that framework is being dismantled, not through a formal decision, not through international negotiation, through a series of actions that establish new norms. After years of course correction away from direct military intervention in the Western Hemisphere, actions have resuscitated the Monroe Doctrine not to keep the world safe for democracy, but to ensure control. When you can invade Venezuela, what stops you from invading Colombia? When you can threaten to annex Greenland from a NATO ally, what does NATO membership even mean? When you can openly discuss taking control of another country's resources, what happens to the entire concept of sovereignty? This may be the moment when Western Europe realizes that the U.S. has abandoned the core values that united them for the past century. Because if international law only applies when it's convenient, if sovereignty is conditional on American approval, if military force is the first option rather than the last, then the post-war order is over. And here's what terrifies anyone paying attention. In seizing a leader by military force, Pandora's box may have been opened, with Greenland, Colombia, Mexico, and Taiwan watching nervously. If the United States can do this, what prevents China from doing the same to Taiwan? What prevents Russia from expanding further into Eastern Europe? What prevents any powerful nation from taking what it wants from weaker neighbors? This is how stability collapses, not in one dramatic war. In 1,000 precedents that make force acceptable, sovereignty negotiable, and international law irrelevant. Now, there's an argument you'll hear. We're removing dictators. We're supporting democracy. We're helping oppressed people gain freedom. It's the humanitarian intervention narrative. And it sounds noble. Let's examine that claim. In Venezuela, the democratic opposition led by Maria Corina Machado, who has risked her life fighting for free elections, was ignored, with actions shockingly dismissing the authority of the heroic democratic leader of Venezuela's popular opposition. Such a dispensation would crush the freedom and accountability aspirations of the Venezuelan people. The person installed was from the existing regime. The military command structure stayed intact. The security apparatus remained in place. This wasn't support for democracy. This was a change in management while preserving the system. And consider the broader pattern. There was intervention in elections in Argentina and Honduras, attempted interference in Brazil's judicial system, and rewarded allies' human rights violations with lucrative contracts. This isn't about promoting democracy. This is about installing compliant governments. If democracy was the goal, there would be support for institutions, investment in civil society, long-term commitment to building democratic capacity. Instead, there's military intervention, leadership extraction, and resource control. The democracy narrative is a justification. It's not the objective, and the proof is in the results. When you leave the same repressive apparatus in place, when you ignore actual democratic leaders, when your primary focus is oil infrastructure, democracy is not what you're actually pursuing. This matters beyond Venezuela and Iran. Because when the most powerful country in the world decides that military force and resource extraction are acceptable foreign policy tools, the consequences ripple through the entire international system. Latin American countries are watching. They see what happened in Venezuela. They understand the message. If you have resources the United States wants, if you take positions the administration opposes, you are vulnerable. This creates a choice. Align with U.S. interests or prepare for potential intervention. That's not leadership. That's coercion. And it fundamentally changes relationships throughout the hemisphere. European allies are watching. According to surveys, U.S. citizens are opposed to the use of the military in Venezuela, and any strikes will likely force a vote in Congress under the War Powers Act. They see NATO's most powerful member threatening to annex territory from a NATO ally. They see international law being violated. They see values they thought were shared being abandoned. This creates a crisis of confidence in American leadership. And when allies question reliability, they start hedging. They develop alternative relationships. They reduce dependence. The alliance structure that has existed for 70 years begins to fracture. Adversaries are watching. Russia sees that the United States can invade countries and face no meaningful consequences. China sees that sovereignty is conditional. Every authoritarian regime sees that might is what matters, not international norms. This is how global stability erodes, not in one dramatic conflict. In 1,000 calculations made by countries deciding that the old rules no longer apply. But let's bring this back to the United States. Because while policymakers focus on geopolitics, this has direct consequences for Americans. Military spending. Each operation costs hundreds of millions of dollars. Long-term presence will cost billions. That's money not spent on infrastructure, education, healthcare, or reducing debt. And the costs always exceed initial estimates. Always. Political division. 65% of Republicans supported the action compared to 11% of Democrats, and 72% of Americans were concerned that the U.S. would get too involved. This isn't uniting the country. This is deepening existing fractures. International isolation. When you violate international law, when you ignore allies' concerns, when you prioritize extraction over cooperation, other countries respond. They form alternative alliances. They develop economic relationships that bypass the United States. They reduce dependence on American systems. This is soft power evaporating. The ability to shape global outcomes not through force, but through economic integration, cultural influence, and shared values. That power is diminishing. And once it's gone, it's extraordinarily difficult to rebuild. And perhaps most importantly, precedent. The intervention epitomizes the American way of war since 9/11. Stunningly effective tactics by special operations forces, dangerously divorced from any coherent story about how they will produce strategic and political success. The United States has successfully overthrown a foreign leader. But leadership removal does not automatically produce the desired political outcome. History is filled with examples of successful military operations that created long-term strategic disasters. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya. The pattern is consistent. Initial military success, prolonged occupation, mounting costs, unintended consequences, and outcomes worse than the original problem. So where does this leave us? The United States has invaded Venezuela, installed a government it controls, and announced it will manage the country's oil infrastructure. It has threatened similar action against other countries in the region. It has pledged military support for protesters in Iran if the regime responds violently. and it has abandoned the international norms that have governed relations between nations for 3/4 of a century. This isn't making America safer. This is making the world more dangerous. Because when the most powerful nation decides that force and extraction are acceptable policy tools, every other nation adjusts accordingly. The question now is whether this trajectory can be changed, whether there will be political costs for violating international law, whether Congress will reassert its constitutional role in authorizing military action, whether allies will demand a return to shared principles, whether the American public will question why their military is securing oil fields instead of addressing domestic challenges. I don't have an optimistic answer, because the forces driving this aren't strategic. They're political, and politics right now rewards strength narratives over measured diplomacy. It rewards simple solutions over complex realities. It rewards campaign donors over national interest. There are decades of proof that military intervention does not produce the promised outcomes, and history shows where such actions lead. But those lessons require patience, nuance, and long-term thinking, and those are in short supply. So the interventions will likely continue. The justifications will shift. Democracy, drugs, national security, whatever narrative tests well. But the pattern will remain. Military force, resource extraction, short-term gains, long-term costs. And the world that emerges from this will be more chaotic, more dangerous, and less stable than the one we're leaving behind. Not because of external threats, because of choices. Choices to prioritize power over partnership, extraction over cooperation, force over diplomacy. The world's policeman has become the world's oil baron. And that transformation will have consequences that extend far beyond any single country, any single operation, any single administration. The precedents being set today will shape international relations for decades. And by the time we fully understand the costs, it will be far too late to reverse them.